It's about that time. So far, we've built the entire Focus Time app. But now it's time for us to go and actually look at how to take Focus Time outside of the Snack environment and run it locally on our computer. Now, don't be afraid. This is a complicated process, but we're going to break it down step by step. And by the end of this, you'll be running the Expo app locally on your computer. And that is what we're trying to accomplish here, being able to run Focus Time locally. Okay, so first off, here we are in Expo on the Snack interface. And what we want to do is we want to go and open up our Focus Time snack that we've been building so far. And once we've opened that up, if we go over here to the project section, the first thing we need to do is we need to say export project. And when we export project, it's going to say, hey, do you want to allow downloading from snack.io? At least it does this in Safari. In other browsers, it may just automatically download. We're going to say allow. And so with that, what we're going to get is the Focus Time folder. Now, this contains all of the files that you require to run Focus Time locally. Okay, so what have we done so far? We've gone in our snack, we've exported it, and we now have all of the files, all of the code that we made, we built it locally, right? We exported it and we have it locally now. Okay, so what do we do from here? Well, let's get into that step by step. Now that we've exported Focus Time locally, the next thing we need to do is put it in a right place. So pick a folder, any folder. It doesn't matter if you're on Mac or Windows. Just go ahead and drag it over or copy paste it to a place on your operating system where you want it to be. And so in this case, I'm going to create a folder projects. And in that folder projects, I'm going to put Focus Time. And now Focus Time is inside of Documents, Projects, Focus Time. So just make sure it's in a right place. And then the next thing we need to do, the next thing is we need to have something called Git. Now, what is Git? Git is nothing more than a tool that we use in order to be able to manage our code, right? Git is a free and open source distributed version control system designed to handle everything from large to small projects. Okay, so how do we install this? Well, that's a good question. The first thing we need to do is open something called terminal. And when we open this thing called terminal, what we can do now is we can write a command cd, and when we press the tab button, we can go to documents. And if we press tab, it'll autofill and will allow it access to our documents folder. And then what we'll do here is we'll go into projects. And then if we ls in here, we know we have Focus Time, right? Let's open this a bit. So we have Focus Time over here. Okay, so if we cd into Focus Time, we now know that we have all of our files. So is Git installed by default on Mac? Well, let's take a look. Let's write something called git init. And it's going to say, oh, hey, you're trying to use the git command. No developer tools were found. If you already have everything installed, this command will have worked, but otherwise you may see this screen. So we're going to just hit install, and we're going to agree, and it's going to start finding the software. It's going to start installing all of the tooling on your Mac that you require. Now, the software update server is out of order. So what happens then? Well, then we just go ahead and download it from here. So how are we going to do that? Well, the first thing we need to do is, if you have Homebrew, you can do something like this. Or you can do what we did before, and you can maybe try again until the software center does have the code that you need. Sometimes this may flake out and you may need to try again. Don't get frustrated. These things can happen. You see, again, I can't install software because there is no currently available from the update server. Okay, so what do we do in this case? We can go to the App Store and we can go ahead and try to install something called Xcode. And when we install this, well, what it's going to do is it's going to install a bunch of developer tools. And together with those developer tools, will come a lot of different software. Okay, so don't panic just yet, because even I, on a new install of my Mac, hit a brick wall. And this can happen. But again, if you hit a brick wall, reach out to our amazing community on Discord, and they're more than happy to help you out with whatever you're facing. Now, let's just wait for this to install. And once it's done, we can continue trying to set up our environment. All right, so we fully installed Xcode, and this can take a while, so be patient. Now, when we open it, what we're going to see is that it's going to take a while to take into account everything that needs to, it's going to pull together resources basically. So this also can take a while. This is a game of patience mostly. So let's agree with the SDK agreement. Let's fill in our password, and it's going to install a bunch of components. It's going to do a bunch of things that it needs to do in order to run. And then hopefully by installing this, maybe we alleviate our Git issue, or maybe we need to go look at what exactly is happening with the software update service. But sometimes it's as simple as understanding that some of the resources that are required can be looped in with other packages. So Xcode may indeed install the component we need for Git as well, because we want to be able to keep track of what we're doing. We don't want to lose progress. It's very vital. And you may already have Git installed, and at that point, you should be set, but this is for those who don't. And also looping in the Xcode installation helps out. So let's loop back when it's installed all of the components. All right, so it's just done installing all of the components, and now we get the welcome to Xcode screen. And so with that, we have everything installed here. So let's go back to our terminal window, and let's run git init again. And what's going to happen here is, as you can see with the Xcode installation, it looped in the Git installation. So that's important to know. By installing Xcode, we now have Git available. And we have initialized an empty Git repository in the Focus Time app. And so what we want to do next is we want to do git add.a, git commit-am. We're going to call it initial. And that's going to add everything into here. And so the next step I'm going to show you is how to push this code up so that you can keep track of it on something like GitHub. So far, we've done a lot of the initial setup, but we haven't run our application just yet. And so one of the crucial components of running React Native is something called Node.js. And so when we use Node.js, we can install it locally on our computer. Now, we always want to go for the LTS. This is the long-term support version. It is the most stable, and it's recommended for most users. If you go to the one with the latest features, you may run into potential issues. But that being said, with React Native, you never know what version it's going to need. It may need later versions or whatnot. For now, with the LTS, we should be good. So let's allow that to download. And if you already have Node installed, just set it to 14.15.0 if you have a version manager, or reinstall it with the newest version like we're doing over here. We're going to go through the installation pretty quickly and just accept, because all of this is pretty standard. And so it's going to start writing files, and we're good. Now it's going to say the package was installed over here. Make sure that user local bin is in your path. Interesting. What does that mean? Well, let's go look. Let's move that to the trash, and let's do something called echo path. Well, as we can see, it echoed out user local bin and all of this stuff. And it said, make sure the user local bin is available. Well, it is. Okay. So how do we know that it works? Well, let's do node -v. Oh, 14.5.0. We have Node installed. Amazing. Amazing. Okay. So now that we have Node installed, we're halfway there. But the next thing we need is something called yarn. And what is yarn? Well, it's not a ball of yarn, I can tell you that much. It is a package manager that works to get our packages. Now, this one is developed by Facebook. And you could just as easily use something called NPM, which ships standard with Node. It's also a different type of package manager. But since this one is built by Facebook, right? Yarn is built by Facebook. And since React Native is built by Facebook. I've always found that Yarn has been more reliable with React Native projects. So we want to make it as easy as possible. So how do we get started? Well, if we go to the getting started and we go to installation, it's going to tell us to do npm install -g yarn. And I just told you about npm. npm is a different package manager. Well, npm ships standard with Node. So if we did node -v, we're going to have 14.5.0. And if we did npm -v, it's going to tell us we have 6.14.8. So npm shipped with the Node installation. Now what we're going to do is we're going to do something called npm install -g yarn. This is a global installation. If we run that command, what's going to happen? Access denied, permissions denied, all of this stuff. Now, why is it doing that? Well, that's because we don't have root possibilities. So should we run it with sudo? Well, if we run it with sudo, now it will have access. Sudo is kind of like the ability to run something as a super user. And so now if we do yarn -v, we're going to have 1.22.0. Now you could also do this with Homebrew, but it's best to do it this way. And now that we have this 1.22.0, we're making sure that we're in the focus time folder that we created. And we're going to do something called yarn. And so now it's going to start installing all of the different dependencies that you need. And feel free to slow this video down, go back, follow the commands step by step. If you run into any issues, please reach out on our Discord community. That being said, the majority of this, if you're coming from a clean install, should be pretty straightforward. This particular MacBook that we're doing this on has had a clean install, so we're starting fresh, just like anyone who doesn't have prior packages. Be aware that if you do have prior Node versions, npm versions, make sure to align them with the versions that we've showed in this video. So we've installed Yarn, and now we actually need to get into the majority of the setup here. The next thing we need, and the thing that the snack was focusing on so heavily for us, is everything to do with Expo, which is a package, right? It's a package that's handling the majority of this for us. So what we want to do is we want to sudo again. And we want to sudo npm install -g expo CLI. And that's going to globally install expo CLI for us. And that expo CLI is what's going to be handling, running the app, communicating, and all of this different stuff that we're going to see. So just wait until this fully installs. And once it's fully installed, we'll be able to try to run our app locally. Now that it's done installing Expo CLI, let's do something called cat package.json. And I know we're doing a lot in command line, and we'll get to installing an editor and all of that good stuff. But I want to make sure that your local setup is as robust as possible. So if we cat package.json in the focus time folder, always make sure that you're in the right folder. We can do something called scripts. Scripts can be executed. So we have a start, we have an Android, we have an iOS, we have a web, and we have an eject. And ejecting is the ability to eject out of Expo at any given point. We don't need to do that right now, or maybe at all. Who knows? Follow along the course. Jokes, but we installed Xcode locally. So let's try to run yarn iOS. And so it's going to do Expo start iOS. It's going to open the developer tools. And so over here, you can see that it's going to ask us to allow access to the control system events, to the documents folder. We're going to allow all of that. And over here, you can see it's starting a simulator. And the simulator is going to be what's running our app. And over here, you're going to see that it's going to be doing a bunch of stuff. Open Expo Dev Tools. It's going to tell you at what URL it's running. This is the same URL. And it's going to say, starting the iOS simulator. This may take a moment. And this can take a while. As you can see over here, it's trying to install. And it's waiting because this is still booting up. We're just waiting for all of this to kind of round out. And once it's rounded out, we'll see the simulator pop up, boot, and have the Expo app installed. It's going to ask us to open Expo. We're going to say open. And boom, Expo's opened. And what's happening now? It's bundling the JavaScript. It's getting our code on the phone, on the simulator. So we're running it on our own computer. Exciting stuff. Okay, so it's bundling, and over down here you can see the progress it's making. And over here you can see the same amount of progress. So you have two indicators of the progress. And now that we're running it locally on our simulator, what you're going to be able to see is that, hey, our app focus time is running on this simulator, and we can fill stuff in, we can press plus, we can start it off, it's going to start counting down, and eventually it's going to finish the task, and boom, we're done. We're able to run our app locally. Okay, so running the app locally tells us that we're in a good state. And you could even take this local installation and run it on your phone by saying, hey, scanning this QR code. And as long as you're on the same Wi-Fi network, you can run it off of your own computer. That's great. You could toggle production mode, and so then it's going to make a production build. Honestly, so simple. Couple of commands, couple of installs, couple of packages we needed, and we're running it on iOS already. Amazing. Now let's look at how to run it on Android locally. Right now we have our focus time running locally on an iOS simulator, and we got that far. But now the next step is, well, how do we get it running locally on an Android simulator? And that's a good question. First of all, to do Android development, you need something called the Android SDK. But in order to download the Android SDK, there are multiple ways. We're going to show you the simplest path forward, and that's something called Android Studio, the fastest tool for building on every type of Android device. And this is made in conjunction with JetBrains. And this free tool is basically what a lot of developers use to develop Android applications. And it ships with all of the information that you need. So what we're going to do here is we're going to press download Android Studio. We're going to say I have read and agreed to the above terms, and we're going to download it for Mac. We're going to allow the download to come through. And once it's downloaded, we're going to run through the installation process. All right, so now that it's downloaded, we're going to see something called Android Studio IDE. We're going to press that. We're going to press that download, and it's going to start opening that download file. And once that's fully opened up, what we're going to see is the start of the installation procedure. So what we're going to do is we're going to drag Android Studio into applications. And that's going to put all the necessary files in place for us to be able to use Android Studio. All right, amazing. Now that we've downloaded and applied Android Studio in the applications, let's see what other steps we need to take. Now that Android Studio is installed, we want to open it up. And how do we open it up? Well, the first thing we can do is we can press Command Spacebar, and we can look for Android Studio. And when we find that and we open it up for the first time, what we're going to do is we're going to run through a couple of things. It's going to tell us, hey, this is an app download from the internet. You sure you want to open it? We're going to say open because it's fine. And we're going to say do not import any settings because we don't have any prior settings. And it's going to start initializing Android Studio for us. We're not going to send statistics. And so now it's going to go through a small setup wizard for us. And what we're going to do is we're just going to follow it. We're going to say, hey, we want a standard setup, or maybe we want to customize it, but most likely we want a standard setup. We can choose between a light and a dark theme. I prefer the dark theme. And what it's going to say to us is it's going to say, I'm going to download the Android emulator. I'm going to download the software development kit for platform 30 and all of this other stuff. Amazing. It's doing the standard installation that we need. And we're going to say finish. And now it's going to go through the download procedure, getting all of the things that the Android software development kit needs. And that is in turn what's going to allow us to run our Expo app on the Android simulator. And so once this installation procedure finishes, we're going to set up our first emulator. We've hit a critical portion in the installation process. It's going to ask you a couple of times potentially to fill in your password because certain software that it's trying to install is trying to make changes. And this is just something that the installation procedure requires. So we're just going to fill in our password and say okay, because it's okay that it needs to do these things. Now it's going to say, hey, the system extension is blocked. So let's open privacy and security, and it's going to take you to the right place. And what we're going to do here is we're going to press the little icon, and we're going to use our password or finger if you have that ability. And we're going to say allow. And that's going to allow the software to do its thing. We always want to make sure that we're following along and reading exactly what happens. The whole point of this is that the installation happens completely and correctly. Now, with that said, if you do run into any issues, again, you can reach out on our amazing Discord community or in the Q&A section. We really recommend joining the Discord community as we really help each other out there. We've obviously fast forwarded through the majority of the installation process, as the installation process and the installing of all of these different portions of Android Studio can take a while. So be patient. And then once you reach the screen, you can press finish. And once you've finished, you've now completed the Android Studio installation. So now let's go see how we're actually going to run on a simulator. Setting up an Android emulator is a very, very simple thing. But unless you know where to look, it can be quite a challenge. So on this screen where it says welcome to Android Studio, we don't have a project yet. We don't have anything to open, but we have this little configure button over here. And if we press it, it'll show us all of the different things that we can use in order to configure Android as an environment. And if we go look at something called AVD Manager, that's the Android Virtual Device Manager, what you're going to see over here, if you spread it out a bit, is that we have a Pixel 3a already configured. Now, if you don't have a device configured or something's going wrong, you can also create a virtual device, and you can create one to your own specifications, Pixel 4, Pixel 4 XL. And so all you have to do is press Pixel 4. Then you can just go over here and say, okay, what version of Android do I want it to run? Do I want it to run Q, Pi, Oreo, all of those different things? And so if we go over to the x86 images, you can obviously see that we already have the version R downloaded in x86. The one over here is a 64-bit above. So the difference is the ones that you've downloaded don't have the download sign beside them. So you can go look at different types of images that you could put on it. You could put nougat, marshmallow, lollipop. You could test devices with many different versions. We're going to use the one that we already installed, which is R. And we're going to press next. And we're going to say, okay, the setup orientation is going to be portrait, all that good stuff. You know, pretty basic. We're not going to change too much. And we're going to say finish. And now we have a Pixel 4 as well. So we have a Pixel 3 and a Pixel 4. Amazing. And so now that we have our virtual devices, well, what's the next step for us? Well, if we open up our terminal, so the next step for us is obviously to go back to our project, which was in documents and then projects. And then inside of there, we have focus time. And right now, if we cat package.json, we can see that we have the yarn android command. So let's run that, yarn android. And what that's going to do is it's going to run expo start android, which is going to, in the background, make sure that it runs the Metro bundler, it finds all of the relevant resources it needs, and then try to figure out, hey, well, can I actually run a Android? And then you could see no Android connected device was found. No emulators could be started automatically. Interesting. So let's go back to Android Studio then, because it's clear that we have our emulators, but it's not able to start them. So how do we go about that? Well, if we go into AVD Manager, we can just press the little play button here. And what the play button is going to do is it's going to start our emulator for us to make sure that in the cases where, hey, Expo isn't able to automatically start it or something went wrong, that we have that control. And so it's going to request some things. We're going to say, okay. And then as the emulator starts up, we'll be in a good position to kind of test out our application. Over here, you can see it's still a black screen. Be patient. Starting up an Android emulator can be a long process, and it really depends on how fast it goes based on your system setup, like how much RAM you have, what type of processor you're running. So be very patient. And if you have a local Android device, you can always scan the QR code and run it locally instead of on the emulator. But this is just a possibility in case you do not have an Android device. So let's go ahead and let's Control C inside of the Expo Manager, and let's do yarn Android once more. And what that's going to do is it's going to reboot the Metro bundler. And if we go over here, it's downloading the Expo client, installing the Expo client app on the emulator. So it clearly found everything it needed. It found our current emulator that we started. And so after the installation, what it's going to do is it's going to boot up Focus Time in the emulator. And so as you can see, the emulator has started the Expo app, and it's building the JavaScript bundle just like it did for iOS. And once this bundle has finished building, we have a fully running Focus Time locally. That's amazing. We can run it both on iOS and Android. So if you're missing one or the other device and you want to run locally, you don't want to run inside of a stack, you can use these emulators, these virtual devices that run on your computer, to kind of be able to build and run Expo without any issues. And as you can see here, now we're able to run our application locally and test it out in a way that we could on iOS as well. One of the last things that we need to do to set you up on Mac is we need to give you a place to code. Now, we're not going to have the editor that we originally had on Expo Snack. And now that we're running locally, the code that we wrote on snack.expo.com, right? If we go to our Expo Snack, this is a random snack, for instance. The code that we wrote in here isn't going to work locally. This runs inside of the browser. So we need an environment specifically for us to write code on our machine, on our computer. And for that, we're going to use Visual Studio Code. This is a code editor, and it says code editing redefined, and that's an understatement because this is a tool that once you master, it's used in many, many, many workplaces. It's used in a variety of different tech industries, whether it be front-end, back-end, and even Python developers. You can use it for pretty much anything at these days because it is so basic and can be enriched through something called plugins. But for our purposes, we just need the basic version. So what we're going to do here is we're going to download it for Mac. And that's going to initiate the download of Visual Studio Code. And then once it's done downloading, what you're going to see is that it is going to become available to drag and drop in your applications folder. Once you do that, so it's going to be in a zip file. And then once you undo that zip file, what you're going to see here is that you have something called Visual Studio Code or Visual Studio Code 2 because I've downloaded it multiple times at this point. And what you do is you can drag and drop that right into your applications folder where you keep all of your applications. Now, I already have it dragged and dropped in there. So once you drag and drop it in there, when you open it up for the very first time, what you are going to see is this interface. And this interface is what we're going to work with throughout this course. Now, don't be overwhelmed here. Like, there's a lot going on, but we're going to go through it step by step. Now, over here, you can see on the left-hand side, there is a panel. And each one of these icons goes to a different place. This goes to the Explorer, File Explorer. If we were to open a folder here, we could see all of the files. This is for searching for specific text or whatever else if you're trying to search through your code. Here is source control. So remember when we installed Git? You can control everything that has to do with Git from here. And we're going to control everything from here. This is going to be our one-stop solution to handle everything. We're not going to try to go outside of this. This is going to be where we do the bulk of our stuff, where we write our code and where we do everything. Now, it has a bunch of different tools. You can install extensions and everything else. But we don't need very many of those. Basically, with just this installation, we can write code. We can write our master project. And so now you are basically set up to hit the ground running. Isn't that amazing? Hey y'all, remember when we installed Git and it was this whole process and we really didn't do anything with it? Well, we're about to get into it because we just installed Visual Studio Code. And because we installed Visual Studio Code, what we can do now is we can go through the process of using Git. And so what I want you to do is I want you to go find the folder that you downloaded, that you extracted. Now over here you can see that I have a bunch of other stuff going on, but I have my focus time folder over here. So I'm going to open this focus time folder and I'm going to say open this. And what's going to happen is Visual Studio Code is going to open all of this code inside of this interface. And over here you can see all of this weird stuff, the welcome screen. We're going to close that. We're going to just focus. We're going to hyper focus. We're going to focus on this left-hand side. Let me enlarge that a bit, a little bit less. And what we want to look at here is this left-hand pane. We can see our files. We can see our assets. We can see our source files. We can see all of that stuff. Here, we remember when I said we had all of these icons? Well, this icon, the third icon, the source control icon. Well, this source control icon, it contains the magic that is needed to utilize Git. And the reason that I want us to utilize Git inside of Visual Studio Code is because we could go ahead and we could use terminal and we could look like we're powering through the matrix. But we really don't need to do that. I like simple things. And so the simplest thing we can do here is currently focus time that we downloaded isn't tracked by Git. Now Git is a version control, right? So it's keeping revisions of things. It's kind of like you going through and saying like, hey, today I did this, yesterday I did this, the day before that I did this. It's keeping a history of what happened in the past. Doesn't necessarily know what's going to happen in the future. It's keeping track of what happened in the past. So if we hit this button, initialize repository, what's going to happen is you're going to see changes, 19 files, all of them marked with a U. U, untracked. Okay, so Git is saying, hey, I see all these files. I see you did all this stuff, Mo. I don't know what it is. I've never seen these files before. I don't know what you're talking about. And if we go over here into our Explorer, you'll see the exact same thing. Everything is green suddenly. Why? Well, it's all untracked. Git has never seen it before. So what we want to do here is we want to go back into that source control. And we can see here that it's in this changes accordion. So, and we have the option to either open the file, so we can go and open it. Well, not the DS store. We can open app.js, and we can kind of go look at like, hey, what's going on here? We can revert it, which we don't want to discard the changes. We want to keep them usually. Sometimes you may want to discard what you did. But you can see the plus sign here, which is stage changes. And stage changes is nothing more than telling Git, hey, track this. Keep track of this. I need this stuff. So we'll hit the plus, and then you can see in stage changes, app.js came in here. And if we hover over the A, it's added. So Git is starting to track it, but it isn't done yet. So if we press the plus at the accordion level here, stage all changes, all the files are now staged. Staged meaning that Git is in this phase where it's saying like, hey Mo, I know you want me to track this stuff, but you really got to tell me what is all of this? Like what's going on here? So it's asking us up here, enter a message. What kind of message? Well, we want to enter a message to tell Git, hey, this is what's happening here. Well, since this is our very first one, we'll say initial entry. This is our first time entering anything into Git. And we'll say commit. And now everything is tracked by Git. Now, for instance, let's say if I did a console.log here and I said YOLO, because you only live once, you know, and that's saved. Well, over here, you can see if I refreshed, which it already did, there's an M for modified. And if we click that, you can see now the change between the previous file and what we changed. Very powerful stuff. Extremely important that we use this to keep track of our code and what we changed. It's very easy to get lost when you have thousands and thousands and thousands of lines of code in what you changed, where it was changed, what happened. All this stuff is like very confusing. So this is the method we'll be using to keep track of stuff. And so if I said like here, okay, well, let's track this one. Let's add it. It's staged now. So it's no longer changed. It's also changed and staged. You want it to be in staged before you can add a message, because otherwise Git's going to say like, well, I don't really know what you want to do here. So like if I unstage it and it's in changes and I just said here console.log added, well, it's going to say like console.log what? You can't really like, what am I going to commit? If I commit, there are no staged files to commit. Okay, well, let's stage this. Now I can go ahead and commit this. So Git knows that it changed, right? But let's unstage this and let's revert this because we don't want it. Now, be careful with discarding changes. Be careful with reverting, undoing, right? Be careful with this button in general, because once you undo it, you're not getting it back. It's not happening. So if we undo it, be very careful with that button. Okay, so now we know how to use Git in Visual Studio Code, and we understand the benefits of Git. It's keeping track of stuff. It's keeping track of where files are, what's happening in the file, and all that good stuff. Super, super important stuff. Super, super important for us to know how to use it. Now, we're not going to become power users from day one, but as you continue using Git, and as you continue down the path of mastery of React Native and all the other technologies out there, you will become more and more inundated with Git. Super vital tool used across the industry in multiple workplaces everywhere. All right. Git, super powerful. Visual Studio Code, super powerful. This little tab here, our main interface for Git. All right, we're about to start our journey in developing locally on Windows. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean? For the majority of the time now, we have been coding in this web browser, but it's time to say goodbye to the old and say hello to the new. New being developing on our computer locally. Now, how do we go about that? Well, first of all, we want to take this app that we already know works, that we've set up here in this way, and we want to take that and make sure that we can run it locally because it's our baseline, right? At the end of the day, we just built this and we know it works. So what better way to validate that what we're doing is going to work than taking this app, setting everything up locally and making sure that we can run this app, because that will verify to us that we've done everything correct. So the first thing we need to do here is we need to press these three dots over here, right there. And you're going to see three options: import, import, export. Now, what do you think we're going to do? Ding, ding, ding. We're going to export. We're going to export our project so that we have it locally. That's what we want to do here. So we'll hit export. And what we'll get is, well, a reminder to protect our computer. But what we'll get down here, if we're in Edge, if you're in any other browser, we'll say, do you want to save the focus time zip? So we'll say save. And once we save that, we can open the folder that it's saved in. And what you'll see over here is focus time 1. Now, I've obviously already downloaded it once before. If we right click that and we say open a new window, basically we'll get the ability to get the folder focus time, which will have all of our assets. So we're opening the zip file. This is a zip file. So we've opened it here. Now what I want you to do is I want you over here in this window, if you have two windows, or open a second window, I want you to go to your documents folder. And in your documents folder, what I want you to do here is I want you to drag and drop focus time from within the zip that we opened. I want you to drag that folder and I want you to release it inside documents. And so in documents now, we have focus time. And with focus time there, we have all of the information that made our application run inside of Expo. All of the code that was in here, all the code that we wrote, all the code that made our application work is now on our computer inside of the focus time folder inside of documents. So make sure that all that code is there. And then once you have that ready, we can move on to the next step. I want to ask you a question. have you ever been in the situation? Maybe you haven't coded any time previously, but have you ever been in the situation where you're working on a document, whether it be a Word document, an Excel document, or whatever else, and something happens? Boom, file gone. Well, in coding, we have methods to avoid this happening once and for all. And on top of that, that methodology extends to working in teams and all of these other nice things. Well, what is this methodology I speak of? What is this black magic, Mo? It's called Git. And what Git is, it is an open source version control system, distributed. Mo, you're throwing a lot of words at me here. What does that mean? Well, I'll tell you what it means. Basically, what Git is, it's an ability for you locally to keep revisions of your work. So just like a Word document, you're saving your work, but it goes beyond that. It allows you also to keep a history of your work. Now, whoa. How does it do that? Well, it's a very complicated technology under the hood. But what basically we need to get out of it, and what you need to remember about Git, is that it is going to take care of us saving our work and keeping a history of what we've done. Have you ever worked at like a factory or something where you have to tick your card when you come in and you go out? It's kind of like ticking that card. You know when you ticked all week, you ticked in at 7:10, 7:15, 7:20. Well, Git is kind of the same way. You're checking in what you've changed at specific times. So we're going to save our work, but we're going to save it in a way that we know what we've done and what the history was and when we did it. And that's going to be important for us, not for the short term, but for the long term. Because everyone can work on projects individually, but it's when you want to start collaborating, or when you want to start keeping more complicated changes, or you want to branch off and try something real quick. Things like that, when you want to experiment and all that good stuff. Once I teach you Git, or once you install Git, for instance, you're going to open a whole new world of possibilities for yourself. So what we're going to do here, we're going to press download Git for Windows. And downloading Git for Windows, we're going to hit the save button. Boom, run the security scan. We're good. Now, it's going to give you this Git installation. You're going to double click that. And once you double click that, it's going to ask you if you want to run it. We're going to say yes. And then once we start running that, what we're going to do is we're going to go through the installation step by step. So first, it's going to give you a whole bunch of information. Let's say we read it. You don't have to actually scroll to the bottom, but you know. Then we're going to press next. We're going to say where we're going to save it. Always leave this wherever it originally decides. If you're a more advanced user, you can obviously change this. But for all intents and purposes, we're going to store it on our C drive. Our C drive is our hard drive. This is what Windows calls it. We're going to save it in the folder program files. This is where software is saved on your computer. And we're going to save it in the folder Git. All right, don't change that. Now we're going to press next. And by default, it's going to install all of these things. All of these things. Now, do we need anything else? Well, we can add a desktop icon. Sure, add a desktop icon. And then you can check for updates daily if you want. That would be useful if you're going to end up using this in the longer term. And you can install a font optionally if you want to. I'm not going to do that today. Okay, so now it's going to take you and say, hey, create shortcuts. Well, let's create a shortcut. All right, so in this next step, it's going to ask us to choose the default editor that we want for Git. Now, Vim is the default editor for Git for Windows, only for historical reason, and it's highly recommended that you switch. So what we're going to do is we're going to switch because it already says here, the Vim editor, which is powerful, can be hard to use. We don't want hard to use. I like simple things. Simple things are good. So we're going to switch to something called Visual Studio Code. So let's download that as well, because as you can see here, it won't let us press next just yet. So let's save that. And then once that's saved, we'll quickly install Visual Studio Code. So we're pausing our Git installation right here. And we're going to run this. And once we run this, we're going to say, I accept the agreement. So right now we're installing Visual Studio Code, which is going to be used by Git. So let's slow this down. What is Visual Studio Code even? Well, Visual Studio Code is where we're going to code. It is the environment in which we're going to put all of our code, we're going to write our code, and we're going to do a whole bunch more stuff. So it's good that we're installing this already. And it's good that the Git installation kind of told us, hey, you need this. Switch. So we're going to do that. So we're going to press next, next, next. We're going to create a desktop icon. And we're going to press install. And then once Visual Studio's installation is complete, hopefully we can go to the next step in our Git installation. So, bada bing, bada boom. This is installed. We can launch Visual Studio Code. This is looking good. So this is Visual Studio Code, but we'll get back to that later. Now, what is happening over here? Can we press next? Well, we can't. Okay, so you can see here, when I pressed back, originally the next button was still grayed out. When I pressed back and forward again, now, when I use Visual Studio Code, because I went a bit quickly, right? So, it's grayed out again. Why is it grayed out? Well, let's press back and let's press forward. And now it figured out that Visual Studio Code is there. So let's press next again. And let's leave this to let Git decide. This is adjusting the name of the initial branch. Let's just, let's let Git decide. And so adjusting the path environment. So let's just leave this as is. Let's leave it on the recommended setting. If you're a more advanced user, go ahead and try things out, but let's leave it on the recommended settings for now. Now, choosing the HTTPS transport backend. What does that mean? Let's just leave it to OpenSSL, the default. Now, configuring line ending conversions. These are all very complicated things, but just leave it to what it's selected. Okay. Now, choose a terminal emulator, whatnot. Well, we'll leave it to the default selected as well. And here, choose the behavior of git pull. We're going to leave it again to what it's set as default. Now, what credential helper would you want? Again, we'll leave it to what it has selected by default. And you can always click more information here to see what it's referring to. The Git Credential Manager is just a software that they're giving you. We'll leave it with the selected because you can see here deprecated. We don't want that, or none. We want a credential helper. So let's just leave it at where they left it. Enable file system caching. Let's also enable symbolic links. Let's enable that as well. And now, experimental support. We don't like experimental. We don't like it. So let's press install, and we're finally through it. That was a whole bunch of different stuff we had to go through, and I understand that a lot of it may have been kind of obscure. You may not understand all of it, but don't worry. Once this installation is behind us, we can finally get to the good stuff, which is what we're going to use Git for. And what we're going to use Git for is more important than all of the tiny details and steps we have to go through in the installation. So, first thing we're going to do, we're going to hit launch git bash, and then we're going to hit finish. And this is going to launch this interface, min-gw64. If you're on a 32-bit system, it may be a bit different. We recommend 64-bit system though. So we've installed Git. What do we do now? All right, well, let's go through that. Last we left it, we were left with this obscure screen. This thing that came installed with Git that kind of looks like the Matrix. Well, first and foremost, I want to tell you, we don't need to use this on Windows. If you're a more advanced user and you know how to use command line, go for it. But we installed Visual Studio Code. So let's take a look at how that thing works, because that's what we're going to base all of our knowledge on. Okay. So over here, if you go to File, you can say Open Folder. And if you open the folder to the Documents folder and the Focus Time folder that we said, if you select that folder, it's going to open up here. Now, what you can see over here is that it opened up Focus Time. At the top, you can see the folder name. And then you can see the folders, Assets. You can see the Source folder. You can see the Features folder. You can see the utilities that we made. All very great stuff. If we open the app.js, you can see that it's going to colorize everything and make it nice and pretty. And all of our code is here. Everything we did in our snack is here. And now our objective is simple. Get it to run on Windows. So we're going to do that. But before we do that, I want to teach you this Git thing. And so I promised you that I was going to teach you how to use Git. Now, for that, one of the two things we need to do is Git works with something called repositories. A Git repository is kind of like a box. And you're going to say, like, in this box, we're going to keep our code. And we're going to keep revisions of our code. So every time we change something, we're going to put a new folder and we're going to say, the folder for today is here. The folder for an hour, like when I last did it, is here. The folder for tomorrow is here. We're going to organize our code in this Git repository. So if you press this little symbol here, if you hover over it, it's going to say source control. So we're going to click that. And what that's going to say is the folder that is currently open does not have a Git repository. This folder that we downloaded from Expo Snack is not Git enabled. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to initialize it, right? Right, Mo? Yeah, we want to initialize it. So we're going to hit this initialize button. And what that's going to do is, whoa, what just happened here? What is all of this? Well, it's showing us everything that changed. All of the files that have changed in our folder. And all of these are green suddenly. What does green mean? Green means that they're new. Green means that they haven't been in our repository yet. It's kind of like Git is going through everything we've done and saying, I know this or I don't know this. It's kind of like an auditor. If you've ever been audited, horrible experience, don't go through it. But what it's basically doing is going through all of your files and saying, hey, I haven't seen this before. What is this? Is this new? It's probably new. I haven't seen this before. So over here, you can see it has a little thing called 19. What does 19 refer to? Well, it's found 19 files or folders that are new to it that it hasn't tracked yet. And when we talk about tracking, it's Git doesn't know this file, so it's the very first time that it's seen it. So if it's the very first time that it's seen it, it doesn't have any history yet. Okay, so if we go over here and we look at these 19 files, these 19 changes, what it's going to do now is it's going to say, we can stage the changes. So we can tell Git, hey, track this. Or we can undo it and it's going to remove it. It's going to say, hey, don't keep this file. Remove it. We don't want to remove anything. Don't press that. Or at the top here, we can press the plus button. So if we press the plus button, we can see that there's this new column over here, stage changes. So now suddenly, Git knows about git ignore. And the U changed into an A. So it's starting to track it. Okay, so we're learning, we're seeing that git ignore went from not anything at all to what we put in it. So we're going to be able to see how files change as we go along. Okay, so if we press this plus here at the top, it's going to stage everything. We can stage them one by one, or we can stage them all together. And what we want to do is we want to stage them all together. Okay, so now everything is staged. What does staged mean? Well, staged means that now everything is going to be tracked by Git. And so the little symbol is now an A instead of a U, right? The A and the U is neither here nor there, but just know that new files are going to be green because the changes haven't been tracked yet. So now we have 19 files that went from, I don't know what they are, to, hey, Git is now going to stage these changes. So now we have three things over here. We have a toggle view mode, which is going to toggle different types of views for us to look at the files in. And that's just going to show us different ways of looking at it. We have a commit button, and we have a refresh button, and we have the three dots over here that's going to do a bunch of other stuff. All right, so now that we've staged all of our changes, in the next video, we're going to go look at how we're going to actually put these online. Last we left off, we had staged all of our changes, but we were so far from actually saving just yet. We hadn't saved anything yet. Okay, so why hadn't we saved anything yet? Well, in order to save something, over here, at the top, you're going to see this little input bar. And that's going to allow you to write a message. And that message is going to be a message that you're going to link to these specific changes. So these 19 file changes. So anything that isn't staged, when we write the message, it's going to say, hey, this is what all of these were. So we're going to say, well, this is my initial entry. And my initial entry is like me saying, I'm going to put these 19 files, start tracking them. So I'll press this. We're getting an error. Make sure you configure your username and email in Git. What is that all about? What is this? It's saying no email was given and auto detection is disabled. Yada, yada, yada. It's asking us, please tell me who you are. I'm Mo. How do I tell you? Well, it's going to ask us, run this. Run what? Run git config -- global user.email and then you're at example.com. What is this? Well, this is what we would call a command. And a command is something that we would run in command line. Now, you remember that screen that looked like the matrix that we got when we initially installed? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to copy this very first line. And we're going to go here to the start. And we're going to say git bash. So when we open our git bash, what we're going to have here is an interface that looks like the matrix. Now, if we paste what we originally... looks like I can't paste in here. Looks like you do not have the ability to paste. So we're going to have to type this out. So what does it say? Git space config space -- global space user.email space. We're going to type. How do I type these? Seems that my keyboard is in a different setting over here. So I have to make sure that it's in US. All right. So we want these double quotes, and we're going to say mo@beanie.io. And when we run this, it's going to set that, and then we're going to do git config -- global user.name, and we're going to say mo beanie. All right. So you want these double quotes. For sure, put these double quotes. These double quotes are around the text. This is to identify myself. So we're going to hit enter on that one as well. And then we're going to close this window because we don't want to use it too much. It's too powerful, We're going to use this interface that simplifies things and doesn't make it look like we're doing voodoo magic and is understandable. All right, let's close this output. We don't want to see no errors. When we go back, we had staged our changes. We had 19 files here. And we had said that our message was going to be initial entry. Okay, so let's hit commit again. There we go. We have now committed our files to Git, and it is tracking them. Now, what does this mean? Well, if I go into app.js now, and I, for instance, go inside of app, and over here, I do something like console.log YOLO, you only live once, because, well, you really only do live once. But anyways, that aside, that stupid little quirky thing aside, if we go here into the Git, what we're going to see is that no files have changed yet. Well, of course they haven't. I have to actually save the file. And now that I've saved the file, well, if we go here and we hit refresh, then we'll see that app.js changed. And we can see that, oh, we added a line. So we're able to see what we actually changed in a file. This is so powerful because when you're coding along and you accidentally run into a bug, how do you know what you changed? Well, Git gives you the ability to view your changes. And viewing your changes allows you to see what you changed and what caused the issue. So powerful. And with great power, finish that, comes great responsibility. Okay, I'm being corny. Anyways, so right now, this console log is not something we want. We don't want this file change. So something we can do, I showed you how to stage the change, but I can also show you how to discard the change. And if we discard the change, you're going to get this big yellow box. You sure you want to discard the changes in app.js? Be very, 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 very careful when you discard changes because you're not going to get them back. I can assure you, you will not get them back. So make sure you want to discard what you want to discard because there's no way to undo it. And we're going to discard this console log because we don't want this change. Okay, so now that we've discarded this, what is the next thing we want to do? Okay, well, the next thing we want to do is we actually want to save this somewhere. So not right now, we're tracking the history on our computer. Okay, so everything we've done here so far is all inside of the folder inside of documents focus time. So everything we've done is inside of here. I can hear you asking, Mo, like, what are you talking about? Like, okay, I understand this whole Git thing, you know, where we can see the changes and you stash and you commit and whatever, all this magic. But like, how is Git doing this? Well, if we go to view and we say, you know, hidden items, then we can see that Git actually created a Git folder, a hidden folder. Now, don't mess around with this folder. I would strongly advise that you hide these folders again. But inside of that hidden folder is what Git would call what it tracks. So if you go inside of here, it's tracking a lot of different things. Your current changes, your past changes, where, what, how, and all of that good stuff. So Git is something that's going to track the history of the changes. And so it's doing it all inside of that folder. Okay. So now we have Git installed and we're able to track our history. We know how to commit now. We know that when we make a change, you know, we can fill in a nice message here. We can say, like, if we add the console log back into here, if we go back into app.js and we said, hey, I want to add that console log again, you know, YOLO, then we could go inside of the version control. If we saved this file and we refreshed here, we could add a nice commit message saying, I added a console log. And if we chose to commit that, that is now in our history. And so we'll know when it was changed, why it was changed, what message came with what it changed. Super, super powerful stuff. And so what we want to do now is we want to host it somewhere. And where we want to host it is github.com. And if we go to github.com, this is where the world builds software. You may have heard of it. You may have seen it. We're going to use it. We're going to use it to store our code. Now that we've mastered what Git is on our local system, be it Mac, be it Windows, whatever the case, what we want to do is we want to store our code somewhere. Now, you may be saying, Mo, I'm storing it on my computer. And that's all good and well. But if your computer fails, what happens? Well, what happens is you lose your code. And so what GitHub is this little spaceman. No, it's not literally. GitHub is a place where 56 million developers, 3 million organizations, and 100 million Git repositories live. Now, what does that mean? Well, Git is the place where you code, you collaborate, you develop, you automate, you secure, and you have a community of developers. Now, for those of you who have never used it before, I don't blame you. It's something that developers are very inundated with. And if you're not in the developer sphere just yet, or you're just getting started, all of this may be very new. Now, that said, GitHub is the place we want to be. And once you get into this community, once you get into what they call open source, that's where all the magic happens. Now, don't trust me, trust the 70 million developers that are on here, or whatever the number was. But that being said, what we need to do is we need to take our code and we need to publicize it. We need, not public, you can make it public, you can make it private, you can make it whatever you want, but we want to store it somewhere for backup purposes, but also for sharing purposes, but also for a nice place to go look at your code purpose. So if you're on the go and you want to go look at a piece of code or whatnot, you know, somewhere to store it online. Okay. So what I want you to do here is I want you to sign up for GitHub. If my sales pitch wasn't enough, well, I don't know, but I need you to sign up for it. So go ahead and create an account for GitHub. Go through the process of verifying your account. And once you're all good and logged in, choose a username, fill in your own email address, fill in your own password. And once all of that is done, create your account, right? let's say I made some random account, right? And I did like test password. We could go through the process. Right now, there seems to be an issue here, but I guess if I refresh, it may be okay. There seems to be a small bug over here. Try a different browser, for instance. We could try Internet Explorer. So let's go to that, Internet Explorer. Who would have known I would ever go to Internet Explorer to try things out? But you may see this happen. Don't get scared if you do. Things can go wrong with a sign-up process. And so once you've signed up for Git, what I need you to do is I need you to sign in to your account. So that's what I'll do over here. And so you can see here that I need a two-factor authentication key. And this is because I have two-factor enabled. And if I verify that, now I'm logged in to my GitHub. And so once we're here, we're good to go. You just want to be logged into GitHub. So as you just went through the process of registering and logging into GitHub, we're back in Visual Studio Code. And what I want us to do next is I want us to be able to go take our code and look at it on github.com, because that is the outcome that we want to see. We want to see our code somewhere on GitHub. All right, so how do we go about that? Well, if we press these three dots over here, we can say push, and we can say push to. And it says your repository has no remotes configured to push. So we'll press add remote. And then we'll press add remote from GitHub. So if we click that, the extension GitHub wants to sign into GitHub. Allow. And so authorize Visual Studio Code to access GitHub. If you have initiated this authorization from Visual Studio Code, click continue. So we're going to click continue because we did this. So now we're going to say authorize GitHub for VS Code. And what it wants to do is it wants to read all public and private repositories. All right. So let's go see what's up here. Authorizing will redirect you to there. So why can't I click this button? What's going on here? Well, what's going on here is potentially a bug with Edge. So if you see something like this happen, make sure that you have other options out there. So what we're going to do here is we're going to install Google Chrome. And with Google Chrome, we're going to try this process again. Because as you can see here, we're not able to click authorize right here, which is very painful. So make sure that you have your options. And I'm going to go through the process of going through Google Chrome, and I'll be right back. All right, so I have Google Chrome installed. And as you can see, even I, as the instructor, when I'm setting up a new computer, I can run into issues. And it's about finding solutions. So now that we have Google Chrome installed, you may not need to do this. If you already have Google Chrome, then go through that. But we may want to set our default browser. So choose a default browser, and then we'll go inside of here and we'll say, hey, our default browser is going to be Google Chrome, and that's going to be that. And now we're going to go to github.com, and we're going to go through the process of logging in again. So sign in, and we're going to fill in Mobini, and we're going to fill in our password again. So we're going to use our two-factor key. We're going to hit verify, and now we're logged into GitHub again. Okay, so over here, we're going to go through this process again. We're going to go over here. We're going to say push to, no remotes configured, add a remote. We're going to say add from GitHub. And now what we need to do is we need to copy this link and we need to put it inside of Chrome because it didn't go there. Now, as you can see, green button, not a green button. So some browsers may have bugs. So let's authorize GitHub. Oh no, an error occurred. Please restart to sign in from the editor. Okay, so let's do that. Let's exit out of all of this and let's restart Visual Studio Code for good measure. So let's go back here. And as you can see, all of these issues can occur. It's completely normal. Now, let's go back into source control And let's go over here and let's say push to. Let's add the remote again. Let's add it from GitHub. Let's allow the sign-in process. And now it's going to open with Chrome. So you can see I tried a step where I tried to copy paste the existing URL from somewhere else. Didn't work. So make sure that you restart the process if you see this error where the button didn't work. Okay, so let's hit continue here. And it's going to say allow. And we're going to say open Visual Studio Code. And so allow an extension to open this URI. So let's open that. And there we go. Okay, so now I have access to all of my repositories on GitHub. Now this may be an empty list for you. This may be a completely empty list. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to go back to GitHub, right? Let's go to github.com. And what we want to do is we want to create this repository. We'll call it focus time. And then we'll add a description, focus time app. And you can make it public or you can make it private, either or. Let's create that repository, right? And here, let's press escape. And then let's say push to, again, add a remote. Let's add the remote from GitHub and it's going to go look. And we can see focus time at the top of the list, the repository that we just created. So let's add that. And then let's say, well, the remote name. Please enter a remote name. Well, let's just hit enter. Oh, we can't just hit enter? Well, then let's call it, what do we call it? What do we call it? Well, if we go into GitHub, we can see here that get remote at origin. So let's just call it origin. So origin is going to be where we're pushing our code. Would you like code to periodically run git fetch? You can say yes, you can say no. It's basically going to periodically go and fetch. I really don't like this feature, so I usually set no. Okay, so now that that's done, what we're going to do here is we're going to push. So not push to, we can still hit push to, and we're going to see origin over here. So let's push to origin. And so now it's starting to push. Okay, well, it's asking us to sign in. Didn't we sign in? Well, let's sign in our browser. And it's going to go over here. And we're going to authorize Git Credential Manager. Remember during the setup when we looked at Git Credential Manager? Well, it's coming in here. So let's authorize it. Successful. We may now close this tab and go back to our application. So what's happening now? Well, you could see that there was a bar up here doing some stuff, but what happened? Well, if we go into the focus time, so let's hit this again. Whoa. All of a sudden, our code is in here. All of our code. And it has the message initial entry. Sample snack app. Good. We pushed our code up and it's all visible on GitHub now. So simple, right? But we have to keep in mind all of these simple steps that we needed to go through. Restarting the flow if one of the browsers has an error. Looking at all of the different things that we needed to do here. We needed to add an origin. We needed to push. All new and exciting things. So if this is new to you, slow this video down and watch it very slowly. Go through the process of adding GitHub because it's a key step. Now, it is optional. You can still go through the course without setting up GitHub, but I want to give you the option of being able to push your code up. You could just as well commit locally and just go that route, but if you want to push your code up to GitHub, it's up to you. For my next magic trick, I'm going to make you take your code and put it on GitHub. Now wait for it, because all you need to do right now is make sure you made your GitHub account and make sure that you're logged into GitHub on the main browser of your computer. And then let's hop back to Visual Studio Code, because the last thing we did was we had some changes that we stored. And so let's undo some of these random changes that happened here. We had all of our changes stored in Git. But what we need to know here is that Git is tracking everything locally on our computer. And all of the revisions and all of the changes that are happening to our files are just happening on our hard disk locally. And by pushing them up, pushing is a term in Git, by pushing them up to GitHub, now they're in the cloud. Now we're creating a backup that is public. And this is optional. Obviously, you do not need to do this. You can still do all of your Git stuff locally, and you can forego doing the GitHub thing if you want. But it is an industry standard, and it's good to learn how GitHub works because it's a tool that is widely used in the industry. So we have our GitHub account, our empty shell of GitHub. Now, if we went here and we said push to, where are we going to push to? Well, your repository has no remotes configured. A remote is a place to push to. So a remote in this case would be GitHub. So that's where we want to end up pushing to. So let's say add remote. Now we don't have any remotes. Please provide a URL or add remote from GitHub. So let's click that because that sounds nice. Let's go about doing that. What's happening here? What's going on? Is it stuck? Well, if this happens to you where it's just stuck in this state, make sure to quit Visual Studio Code and restart Visual Studio Code. Make sure that you do this because sometimes it can get stuck in this state. Okay, so let's see here. If we go back to source control, right, and we open recent, we open documents focus time, it seems that my specific installation of Visual Studio Code is corrupt. So let's go and fix that. So if I say Visual Studio Code, what's going on here? It seems that my Visual Studio Code corrupted itself temporarily and I had to restart it. Okay, so let's go ahead and open recent focus time. All right, so focus time is over here. And if we go back to our source control, we already committed all of our changes locally, but now we want to push them to GitHub. So we said push to, and we said add remote. And then we said add remote from GitHub. So now it's working again. So this can happen. You can corrupt your local whatever. Visual Studio Code is not a perfect software. Things can happen. So make sure to restart Visual Studio Code if you get stuck on a step or it's not showing you a certain thing. Restarting usually solves the problem. Otherwise, reach out to our amazing community. So we're going to hit allow. And now it's going to go over here. It's going to say, hey, authorize Visual Studio Code to access GitHub. Cool. Let's do that. And let's authorize GitHub. Let's open Visual Studio Code. So now it's going to ask you to open Visual Studio Code. So let's do that. And so now it's going to say, allow extension to open the URI. Well, we're going to say we're going to allow that as well. So this process is the authentication between GitHub and Visual Studio Code, our coding environment. So let's say open. And so writing login information to keychain failed. Channel name encryption timed out. What is happening there? So we'll go to the troubleshoot guide. If the keychain throws an error, then we need to go to the keychain app and we need to unlock it. Interesting. Okay, so we're in the login. That's done. We're in the system. So what do we need to do here? Open the keychain app and right click on the login keychain and lock and unlock it again. So let's say lock the keychain and let's say unlock the keychain. And let's say our password. Okay, so we unlocked it again. And so now what we want to do is we want to go back to Visual Studio Code. All of a sudden we have access. Interesting. Because it failed before, right? So now locking and unlocking the keychain solved that issue. So let's see if it actually really did solve the issue. So let's go back to GitHub and let's create a repository, new repository, and let's call it focus time. And I'm going to call it Mac specifically. I'm going to say my focus time app, right? I'm going to put this as public. I'm going to create the repository. And then once I create this repository, I can go back into Visual Studio Code. And what I want to do here is I want to go back to here, remote, push. I want to say push to, and then say no remotes configured. So let's add a remote. And then let's say add a remote from GitHub. And now it should have access to everything. So what just happened? First of all, let's select Focus Time Mac. And then let's provide a remote name. And we're going to call it Origin. And so once we set up Origin, we can say push. And then we can say master has no upstream branch. Would you like to publish? Yes. So now we're publishing, and you can see the little arrow going on here. We're going to say do not periodically run git fetch. This means that the Visual Studio Code is going to pull code for you. We don't want that. So let's go over here, and if we refresh this screen, our code is suddenly here. Okay, so let's slow this down. What happened here? Well, first of all, we went through the process of linking Visual Studio Code to GitHub. Then we went through the process of going to our keychain, right? Our keychain app. Because we saw an error. And we locked and unlocked our keychain and filled in our user's password here. The password for the user that you log in with on your Mac. And locking and unlocking that keychain allowed Visual Studio Code to now suddenly have the ability to push to origin. And by allowing that, we can now push changes to GitHub. So let's say if I, for instance, added a console log here, this is going to GitHub, and I said console.log as the message, and I staged this change, and I committed this change. Well, if we go look on GitHub right now, right, on our GitHub, and we said it was going to be in app.js, well, currently there's no console log there. But if we go inside here and we say push, right, we just say push. Well, now it's going to push. And as it pushes, if we go back into GitHub and we refresh, this is going to GitHub. So we're able to publish our changes to the cloud. Now, this is optional. It is optional to link it to GitHub. And if you run into a brick wall here, that's completely okay. You can still continue the course. It's not going to be a blocker. You're just not going to be able to publish it to the cloud. You're still going to be able to code along and keep going along with the course. Now, the reason that we show this is because it's a vital tool in the industry, and it's good to learn early on. I hear you wondering, Mo, I get it. Git is important. But it's also optional to push to GitHub and all these things. But I get it. It's a cool tool. I hear you saying, Mo, it's a cool tool. It's a cool tool. All right. But now, what's up? What's going on here? What are we going to do? Like, I get the whole revision tracking. I get that the files go up into the cloud and can come back to me, and I can see what's changing and all of that good stuff. So I have a proper idea of how to do changes to my code and keep track of the changes. Okay. Well, now comes the good part. Now we're going to run focus time locally. But there's one thing I do need to tell you. As a Windows user, you come with a massive disadvantage. And that is that the Mac ecosystem, Apple, they only allow Apple computers to build for iOS, which means that at the end of the day, we're only going to be able to run on Android. Okay, what kind of disadvantage does this give me, Mo? Well, don't be afraid. If you have your own iPhone, you can still run your Focus Time app on your iPhone directly through the QR code that I'll show you. But if you want to run something called an emulator, and an emulator is defined as a piece of software that is going to act as the phone on your computer. If you want to run software on your computer that's going to act like a phone, act like an iPhone, act like an Android phone, well, on Windows, you're only going to have the ability to do that with Android. So we're going to install something called Android Studio. And this is the one-stop shop for Android developers. Hands down, one of the greatest tools for Android development if you're doing it natively. But in this case, we're not doing native Android development. No. We're doing React Native development, which is so much cooler because we write once, target both platforms. So much cooler than just writing for one platform. But okay, why do I need Android Studio then? You just said it's for Android developers. It comes with tools that are required on your machine locally in order for you to be able to build on your local machine to target Android. You see, when we were running everything inside of the browser, inside of the Expo Snack, behind the scenes, a lot of heavy lifting was going on for us, and we didn't really have to concern ourselves with all of these tools and all of this setup and all of this yada, 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 yada. But now, the yada, yada is important. Now we have to go and we have to get the tools that we need in order to build on our computer to push these changes, or build these changes rather, for Android. Okay, so this is a rather large package and it may take a minute or two. But what we can see here is that Android Studio is going to give us software. And this software, we're not really going to use. It's going to be behind the scenes doing some heavy lifting for us. We're not really going to interact with it all too much. We're going to simplify things and build things, but we need to set it up in order to make sure that we can build out the right way. Okay, so once this installation or this download has finished, we're going to start the installation of Android Studio. And I'll be back for that. Oof. That felt like that took hours. It may, depending on your internet speed, unfortunately. So now that Android Studio is ready to rock and roll, we're going to click it. And when we click it, it's going to start the installation procedure. Now, this may be a longer process, so you have to be patient. And this is where things can go wrong. And depending on your system, you may run into edge cases. Now, Google is always a good place to go look, but we always recommend reaching out to our community first on Discord. So join our Discord community. Join it now. It's amazing. People will help you because with these types of setups, things can go wrong and you want the best help out there. And our community is the best help out there. Now, what we want to select? Well, we want to select Android Studio and we want the Android virtual device. We're going to roll with the basic settings. And now it's going to go through the installation procedure, which may take a while. And it's going to go through extracting a bunch of files, installing a bunch of files, putting things in the right place for us. These .jar files that you're seeing happen and all this stuff. This is all software that is used by Android to build Android apps. It's the native stuff. It's the guts of Android and what it needs to build Android apps that it's installing for us right now. So when we press next, what's going to happen here is it's going to say, hey, import settings. We don't have any settings. All right. Well, if we don't have any settings, what do we have? Well, we have Android Studio now, which is exactly what we need. And it's going to ask us to data share. We're going to say, if you want to send statistics, you can send statistics. It's going to take us through this wizard. And this wizard is to set up our development environment. So we're going to press next and we're going to select standard. And always pick the dark theme. Just always pick the dark theme. It's so much nicer. Okay, so it's going to now install all of the real guts that it needs. So it's going to install something called an SDK or a software development kit. And so it's going to take 1.69 gigabytes of space. Make sure you have that space. And it's going to install all of these SDKs and all of this good stuff that we need. Okay, so press finish. And now it's going to go through the process of downloading these things and putting them in the right place. And if you press show details, it'll tell you exactly what it's doing. It's unzipping a bunch of stuff. It's going to pull a bunch of stuff from online. It's going to install a bunch of stuff. This may take a while. So be patient. And once it's done, we'll be back at it. So I went through my installation process and I saw this. Unable to install Intel Hardware Acceleration Manager. Your CPU does not support it. And that's completely fine. That's okay if you see that. So let's press finish. And now we have Android Studio. So I want you to hit configure. And I want you to go to AVD Manager. This is the Android Virtual Device Manager. Now I want you to hit play on the emulator. And it's going to say cannot start. Why could it not start? Right? What's happening here? Why could it not start? Why? Well, your computer does not support hardware accelerated graphics. So here are some of your options. Use a physical device for testing. Develop on a Windows OS X computer that has Intel processor. Develop on a Linux computer. Use an Android virtual device based on an ARM image. This is 10 times slower. Okay, so if your computer does not have this, well, as we can see here, this default is set up with something we don't have. So this may work for you if you have hardware accelerated management graphics, but this one doesn't. So let's go over here and let's go down here and let's say, let me take a Nexus 5, right? And I'm going to go next. And what I can say is, what are my other images? Which ones do I have? Right? So I have this one over here, the R in the x86. Is this the one I need? Probably. So let's press next. Well, it's saying my CPU does not support VTX. Well, can I use this then? Looks like I have to go to other images, right? And I have to download an ARM based one. So let's go ahead and let's download that. Accept, next. And once this installation is complete, we'll be able to create a virtual device that is supported by devices that don't have a virtual, like an Intel processor. All right, so we have an ARM 64 based image of Android now. And so basically what's going on here is the infinite war between Intel and non-Intel devices. The machine I'm running on does not have Intel. So it may very well be true that that default Android virtual device that was set up may work for you. It did not for me. And that's why we're going through this setup. Do not go through this portion if that play button initially worked for you. Okay. So now we have this. So let's press next. Next is this. Okay. We have an R, all that good stuff. It's an ARM based one. Good. Let's go to advanced settings. And then let's say down here, is everything good? Is everything good? Everything looks good. So let's press finish. And let's try the ARM based one. And so that one was killed. Why was it killed? Well, it's killed specifically because I'm technically running on Parallels. And because I'm running on Parallels, some of these functionalities do not work on Parallels, but I was showing you how you could possibly go about doing this. Now, if you have an Android device or an iOS device, you're still good. I'm just trying to show you how to do this. If this is still a showstopper, you can use your mobile phone to still do the app development. Don't worry about that. I'm trying to show you this. So let me show you how it would look like on Mac. If we went into Android Studio here, Android Studio, and we opened that up on Mac, for instance, which is the default device, and we went into AVD Manager, you can see here that when I press the play button, this is basically what you should see. This device should boot up, and this is what you should have available. This is not what's happening on the Parallels machine that I am running on, and this is a limitation due to the software that Windows is running inside, but just trust if you press the play button, you'll be able to launch an Android, and if it's not possible, you can still use your mobile phone, and that is completely fine. Now, you do not need the virtual devices to run. What you need is Android to be available. And so we have gone through the Android installation. Now, the next part of the installation is we need Node and Yarn. What's that going to look like? Now that we have Android installed, the next thing that we need is Node.js. And what Node.js is not the top search result. No. We have to go down here and we want to download this. Node.js is a software that is basically vital to running React Native locally. And so we want the LTS version, the long-term support. This is the recommended for most users. And once we download that, what we want to do is we want to go ahead and go through the installation procedure once it's done. And what this is going to give us is it's going to give us a whole suite of tools that React Native can use to basically launch and manage React Native. Now, we'll go through the preparation of installation. We'll press next, accept the licensing terms, next. So keep everything to the default. We're going to leave everything as it is. I'm going to press next, automatically install the updates. Next, we're going to go through the installation procedure. We're going to say yes. And then once all of this is done, we're basically going to restart Visual Studio Code. And I'm going to show you why. Because once we restart Visual Studio Code, I want to show you something. I want to show you something really, really cool. So now that this is installed, we're going to say finish. We're going to press enter and enter. And it's going to install additional tools for Node.js. We're going to say, do you want to allow this app to make changes to your device? So press enter. Make sure you press enter when it asks you these things. We're going to press enter, enter. And so what it's going to do is it's going to install Chocolatey. It's some type of software that allows PowerShell to do all of this extra cool stuff. It's going to go through this entire procedure. Things can go wrong here, so make sure if things do go wrong that you reach out to our amazing community, or copy pasting the error into Google often leads you onto a good trail. Now, all of these installation steps are basically so that your Windows computer will be enabled to use Node.js in the right way. And so we're going to let it do this. We're going to let it run with this, do this entire installation procedure. And once it's done doing this, we'll have Node.js available to kind of utilize with Visual Studio Code. So it took a good 5 or 6 minutes for that to finish up, and then the blue screen, the PowerShell, disappeared. Now, if we open up PowerShell, what we'll see here is that we now have access to the command node. Now, this is what we want. So let's exit that. And now in Visual Studio Code, what we have the ability to do is we have the ability to use the terminal. So if we open a new terminal, what we'll be able to see here is that we also have access to the node command. Node is not recognized as a commandlet. Why? Well, let's restart Visual Studio Code because it may not have updated everything that it needed to. So now, let's try that again. Node. And now it has access to it. So if we type exit, it's not going to work. But if we press Control-C, press Control-C again, so you have to press it twice. Pressing Control-C twice exits you out of Node. So now that we have access to Node, what we want to do is we want to install something called Yarn. And Yarn is a different type of package manager. And what we want to do with Yarn is we want to install it. So the installation kind of goes like this. npm install -g yarn. So let's run that command. npm is another package manager that is installed with Node. So if we do npm install -g yarn, what this is going to do is it's going to install Yarn globally. So now if we press Yarn, it's going to say, hey, I don't know what Yarn is. So let's go ahead, close this, open Visual Studio Code again, and it will have refreshed. And now if we run the command Yarn, why is this happening? npm yarn cannot be loaded because running scripts is disabled on the system. For more information, figure out this part. So let's go ahead and let's copy this link and let's go look at what's actually there because it doesn't make sense. So if we execute this, what we're going to see is we don't have something called an execution policy. So how do we go about turning that on? All right. Well, it seems that we need to enable an execution policy. And so how do we do that? So what we're going to do now is we're going to open PowerShell. And by opening PowerShell, what we're going to type is the following: set-execution policy space remote signed space -scope current user. So you want to fill this in as it is right here. And by doing this, what we're going to do is we're going to give the current user an execution policy. So we're going to say yes. And then by doing this, we're going to restart Visual Studio Code again. And what we're going to see is that when it reboots all of this and we press yarn now, it's going to work. So what we basically did here, to summarize it, is we installed Node. With Node came NPM, which is Node Package Manager. It's basically something that's going to install a bunch of stuff for us. But we didn't want to use that because the recommended one by Facebook is something called Yarn. Yarn is also a package manager, so we needed Node and Yarn. And why we need Yarn is because safe, stable, reproducible projects. So basically, if we go look at our package.json of our project, it has a bunch of dependencies right here. And Yarn is what we need to use to install all of these dependencies. So the question is, why did I need to install Node and why did I need to install Yarn? Well, Node is what's used by React Native to basically run React Native. And Yarn is what is necessary to install all of these dependencies. That's why we needed to go through these steps. And Yarn initially wasn't available to run as a command because we didn't have the right permissions. So by running that command in PowerShell, we gave ourselves permissions. That is the summary of what went on here. It's super confusing, I know, and there's a lot of different steps and permissions and all of this stuff. But two things remain certain. Make sure you install Node. Make sure once you install Node that you're patient because the installation can take a while. Once you install Node, make sure you install Yarn. Make sure also that you reboot Visual Studio Code like I did because it may not be immediately accessible and you may hit some walls there. And then install Yarn globally. npm install -g yarn. And you'll see once you install Yarn, it's going to install, but it's not going to be available. Then we set the permissions. And so now everything is set up. We've installed. We now have our Yarn lock file, which means that Yarn successfully installed all of the packages. And now that we have our Yarn lock file and all of our dependencies are installed, we can go ahead and try to run Focus Time, which is what we wanted to do all along. So I'm so excited. The next video, we're going to jump right into it. The one thing that remains to be done is to install the packages, but also next to installing the packages, and let's open another terminal, another PowerShell. Another thing we want to do is yarn add expo CLI. We want to add it globally. So global, -- global. And this will install yarn CLI globally. And so we'll wait for both of these commands to basically succeed. This is installing the local dependencies of the project, and this is installing expo CLI globally. And once both of these are finished, what we'll basically have is the ability to run Focus Time locally. So now that we have everything installed, what we can go ahead and do is we can run yarn start. And this is going to run expo start. And it's going to open the expo DevTools, open the DevTools, and it's going to run everything so that expo runs locally. So expo is now running locally. And what we can try to do now is, if you don't run it with the Android emulator, if you wanted to run it with the Android emulator, however, you could do something like yarn Android. And if you run this command, it'll run inside of the emulator that you've started with Android Studio. But we ran yarn start because we want to run it on our phone. So let me grab my phone and then we can see how it runs. All right, here we are. Expo is running, and all we have left to do is to scan this QR code over here. So if I point my phone at this QR code, it's going to say open in Expo. And if I open that in Expo, what's going to happen is it's going to connect to Expo in Windows. And you can see that this happened because if you go to Visual Studio Code, this is going to GitHub. That's the console log that we just had. And if I refresh it again, well, you're going to see it pop up again. So we are effectively running off of Windows. And if I fill something in here like test, well, then that's going to start playing back. Pause, remove, and we didn't complete test. Amazing. So we've just gone end to end with running on Windows. And it was that simple. Just a couple of commands that we needed to run and we were good to go. And so now there's just one more thing that I need to show you. And that is if you were able to run your emulator with Android Studio and it is up and running and it's booted and you don't have an Android or iOS phone, which is highly unlikely these days, but it can happen. You may have a Windows phone, you may have something else. They do tend to dominate the market. But let's say you have to run the emulator. So if you have the emulator up and running, and this is a precondition, you always have to have the emulator up and running. What you can do is inside of focus time, you can run yarn Android. And what this will do is it will run the same yarn start that we did. It's going to open up the bundler. And then it's going to target our emulator. But not only target our emulator, it's going to install everything for us, and focus time will be up and running inside of our emulator. Before you know it, we can say, hey, let's focus on some gardening. Bada bing, bada boom. We're good to go. And here it is. All right. So now that we know how to run both on our phone and on our emulator from the setup that we just did, we're good to go. So we've reached the end of setup, or have we? Now, one thing to note with React Native here is that issues may arise with your setup for random reasons. This may be due to a faulty state, something went wrong inside of the packager, all types of things can happen. So I want to give you some simple debug steps to help you along the way, because it can be frustrating when you're first starting out to get all of this set up and get all of this in the right order. So there are a couple of solid steps that we can always take in order to make sure that everything is running as intended. First and foremost, make sure that your packager is running. And to do that, you can always run yarn start. Make sure it's running. And when you run yarn start, the packager will run. And it should bring up this localhost 19,002 screen. That's the very first step. Now, if for some reason you're hitting any errors inside of here, or it won't even get to that step, well then there's something else we need to do. Also remember to exit any process, you can press Control-C. Okay, so here's the thing. Let's say for some reason yarn start already errored. Well, what we would need to do here in this case is, if we go to Visual Studio Code, what we would tend to do in this case is, for instance, if we look at our code here, the first thing we would do is we would delete the Node Modules folder. And by deleting the Node Modules folder, we'll be able to basically get to a place where we can restart everything. So you can do that in different ways. You can right click here and press delete, or if you're in a terminal, it depends. You could run rm node modules. If you're on Windows, this may be a bit different. And if we do that, we have to do -r node modules. And so that's going to delete the entire node modules folder. This may take a minute. This is a very large folder. Even when you right click to delete it, it can take a while. But once that's deleted, what we want to make sure is that we run yarn again. And this is going to reinstall all of our packages. So always make sure that if you're running into any issues, you clean node modules and rerun it from the start. Another debug step that is very, very important is, from time to time, if you're using simulators, close them and reopen them, because they can get slow as time goes on. They can be consuming memory. So you may want to shut them down and restart them the way that we showed you to. That's another important debug step. And if you're hitting certain errors that are just blocking you and you don't know what's happening, well, what I would suggest is always taking that error, right? Whatever the error may be, and going to Expo's GitHub page, the issues, and remove this here and try to search for your issue. Use different keywords. You can search for bundler not starting. You can search for the specific error that is happening. And there may be different issues here that come up that could help you. Another way is to go straight to Google and just copy paste part of your error. Selecting part of your error may help you. Or doing React Native Expo bundler not launching, not starting. That can put you on the right track. If all of that fails, always reach out to either the QA section or directly to the community. We prefer reaching out directly to the community on our amazing Discord because we will help you out, whether it be myself as the instructor, Mo, or some of our awesome students that may have run into the same problems because, again, all of what we're learning here is new and setup can be difficult. So it's important to reach out and program along with your peers because this is a learning experience and we want to make the most of it, and you can learn from the others in the community and you can teach something to the others in the community if you find something. It's always nice to share knowledge and receive knowledge from others that have done the same thing. All right, so with that, we'll get into the setup of our master project.